Ahoy! All right, it's time. It's time for Chapter 8 of the Teach Us Dr. Hirsch series. Today we are talking about thinking and reasoning and language because language is a shorter section and doesn't really neatly fit in anywhere else. So I tacked it on to the end of this one. But I swear there is some overlap. So let's get into it. What are we going to be talking about today? Well, like I said, we're going to be talking about thinking and reasoning. Specifically, we're going to be talking about how our brains have sort of systematic quirks or glitches in the system, as it were, that prevent us from being able to deal with some of the other, like, some, blah, blah, blah. We tend to make systematic problems and errors in judgment, and they tend to stem from certain ways that our brains process information. By and large, we tend to be really good at solving problems and incorporating new information and doing all that kind of stuff, but there are, and as you probably know, kind of blind spots in the way that our brains work. So let's talk about those. Let's talk about how they impact decision making, and let's talk about the stages that people go through when they're asked to solve a problem. And we're going to round out talking about language. Where does language come from? Why do we have it? And why are bilingual people magical? At least to me. If you can speak more than one language, you're basically an elf, like a Tolkienian elf to me. You might as well be Galadriel. All right, let's get into it. So thinking and reasoning. Here's the funny part about this. For all of the great computing power that our brains have, we don't necessarily think about things in a precise way. We tend to prioritize speed and efficiency when looking to make decisions or solve problems. And there are some, like I said before, kind of weird quirks that stem from that. So even though we can really drill down and really try to get, a very consistent and well thought out answer to a problem, we don't do it very often because it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of energy. So have you ever been out, let's say, heaven forbid, before COVID, maybe more recently, you're out with friends, and you're hanging out, you're chatting, you're talking, maybe some drinks are involved, maybe you have some alcohol, and then when you sit down, the bill comes and you're just like, you just throw a 20 in. You don't even really look at it. Just like, whatever extra goes to tip. Because sitting down, trying to hash out who owes what, maybe one person didn't just eat, maybe they had drinks, maybe they had a more expensive entree, and it's not worth it. Our brains kind of check out, we zone out, and we just say, okay, we'll guesstimate. And this is how we approach most situations in our lives. And usually that is not only helpful, but necessary. Remember when we talked about sense and sensation? We talked about it a little bit with, that's a good one. I think we talked about it a little with, in the last chapter with memory as well. We have extraordinary amounts of information coming at us all the time. And sometimes we just don't have the energy to attend to all of it. We don't have even the energy to attend to and really deliberately think about the stuff that we are paying attention to. And so we tend to just guesstimate more often than not. And Brent had a really good one. It's your turn to pay and I'll pay next time. He says, fine, it's fine. Like, don't even think about it. Just kind of gloss over the problem and move on. And even though we do have systems in place, like the scientific method, again, we tend to not necessarily be very scientific thinkers when it comes to how we interact with the world. So we tend to employ heuristics, which are sort of rules of thumb or mental shortcuts that are tools that we use basically to make those kinds of estimates. And as a result, because we have sort of a set series of steps that we go through to be able to reach decisions, we tend to make the same kinds of errors in the same kinds of situations. We call these cognitive biases, which means that our default way of thinking is going to make us systematically wrong in some very specific and oftentimes embarrassing situations. You might think, well, that's illogical, right? We're sitting down and we say, all right, well, why would I want to use a set of biases or a set of tools that don't necessarily work all the time? That doesn't make sense. Like, why would I not try to default to just being more deliberative and trying to focus more on the stuff that I'm looking at? Well, the answer is they're right often enough. And sometimes when you're wrong, the consequences aren't that intense. So you just kind of keep going along with it. just the way that our brains work. And like it just said, we really can't go through our daily lives trying to be very deliberative and effortful and process oriented with every problem that comes along. Yeah, yeah. And if you are familiar with the book of Thinking Fast and Slow, this is getting at a little bit of the same stuff. So if you've read that book, there's going to be some overlap here, but let's step out of the pop psych circle and more into the actual psych circle. So the fun bit, at least I think a fun bit about these biases and then these heuristics, just to kind of peel the curtain back and talk about just fun stories and how this research actually gets done, how the sausage of psychology gets made. A huge amount of this research on heuristics and biases came from one professor going on a sabbatical, which is basically a vacation for professors, and deciding, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use my time off to hang out with used car salesmen. And I'm going to look at how they get people to buy cars at a value that is higher than what they're really worth. And so a lot of these sort of heuristics and biases that we're going to talk about really stem from research on salespeople who, out there in the wild, are masters of this craft when it comes to persuasion and taking advantage of the ways that people tend to figure out and work through problems. So here's one. We tend to believe that like goes with like. We call this a representativeness heuristic. And now, this mostly stems from a broader issue that we have, which is that when we sit down and we try to figure out problems, we tend to neglect base rate information. So we tend to not really pay attention to how common something actually is. It's just sort of what it feels like. So even events that seem extraordinarily rare, like going outside and being struck by lightning, might feel more common because there's an emotional component in there, so we reason through things differently. So we just tend to not be very good at computing with base rate information. And so when we come to make judgments, sometimes we employ similarity and not the actual likelihood of an event occurring. So let's say we've got this student, Kelly. They are a student and they're deeply concerned with racial and ethnic diversity on campus. They're a member of the Black Student Union and they often attend their meetings. Now, based on that information, on this hypothetical person, Kelly, do you think it's more likely that they are an African American studies major or a mechanical engineering major? When I give this example in class, most students will just say that they think this person is an African American studies major because that's the information they have. Because we don't necessarily think about base rates. Because it turns out that when you look at this, going by majors, etc., at the time when I was teaching, I did pull this information at a hypothetical university. So you might say, all in all, there are only about 1,500 mechanical engineering majors compared to only 11 African American studies majors. There are way more mechanical engineering majors, and if you had this information, and if you considered this information, the answer is pretty obvious. Kelly's more likely to be a mechanical engineering major, but given the representativeness heuristic and like going with like, you might just make the assumption that this person is an African American studies major, and even if you do know that base rate information, even if you knew that on campus there are way more mechanical engineering majors, so proportionately it's more likely that this person is a mechanical engineering major, when you're actually put on the spot and you need to make that decision, and that's the information that you got, odds are you're probably going to come to the same conclusion that the vast majority of my students have come to when I use this example. So this kind of leads into, given that prospect, so I gave you a little bit of information about Kelly. Kelly is a member of the Black Student Union. Kelly cares a lot about racial relations on campus. So based on that, it's not just the representativeness heuristic that comes into play, it's also the availability heuristic, where we use usually the most recent information that we have heard, or just more what is basically the first thing that comes to mind. So if I were to say, give you a little bit of information about that person like I did, or thinking back to the memory video, remember how we talked about priming? when you give certain seed information, like if you were to say, in the example, I was trying to prime people to fill in a 4-letter blank starting with K with king. And so I might give you words like mattress, queen, chess, and so on and so forth. And getting that information makes king a little bit easier to retrieve, so that then when you encounter that problem where you're asked to fill in the blank and figure out what word I'm guessing here, you're going to be more likely to fill it in as king, because that's just the information that is easiest to retrieve. So let's bounce over. I'm going to give you a fun example here, but before, as I work some magic to go over to my Chrome window, let's think for a second. What do you think is more dangerous, a shark or a jellyfish? And boom! All right, here we go. Get over here. And there we go. All right. Well, it seems like most of you in chat already know this. So, but let's go through, because this is funny. So it turns out that sharks only kill about one person every year. One very poor person is killed by a shark every year. In contrast, holding in too long kills about 2 people. Penicillin kills about 3 people. Pajama fires kill 4 people, not even just fires, but specifically pajama fires. Hang gliders kill 5 people. Fireworks kill 5 people. Spiders kill 6 people. Venomous snakes and lizards, even more than that. Floods about 21. Starvation or dehydration from self-neglect kills about 26 people. Avalanches are 27 people. Lightning kills 31. Dogs! Look at this picture they picked too. Dogs kill 32 people. Canoes and kayaks kill 35. Falling from cliffs kills about 56, and so on, and so on, and so on. Oh, this one's great. Slipping on snow and ice kills about 122. Falling from chairs kills 225. Penis cancer is a serious issue, and you should be checked out, because it kills about 240 people every year. Farming equipment, drowning, exposure to cold, accidentally suffocating in bed, slipping and falling, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. I'm going to scroll back up to the dog, because the dog is too cute. Look at this good dog. Look at this. This dog would never kill 32 people. Yeah, I mean, in some cases, these might feel low. But the thing is, when you come down and you look at a shark, you think about it, Jaws has had a huge cultural impact. And so when you think about which is more dangerous, a jellyfish or a shark, jellyfish don't have the same accessibility of violence and harm that sharks do. Even though, proportionately, jellyfish are way fucking scarier than sharks. If you've ever been on a beach and you've seen a jelly, don't touch it. Don't go near it. It will hurt you terribly, more often than not. Meanwhile, sharks are generally pretty chill. It's very rare that they come close enough to attack people, yet, thanks to movies like Jaws and programming on Shark Week, there is a cultural belief that they're far more dangerous than they really are. And so we end up in a difficult situation where, if asked what is more dangerous, people tend to respond and say it's a shark. Sharks are definitely more dangerous, even though, again, base rate information, basically no one gets killed by sharks in a given year. Let's head back over to, here we go. All right, so now we know that actually pajama fires are far more dangerous than sharks, so please, don't fall asleep next to space heaters. It's not a good time. So here's another good question. Is the United States getting more dangerous? If you look at news tickers lately, you would believe that the United States is getting to be more dangerous. We're seeing top stories every day thanks to algorithms and clickbait headlines of stuff like people escaping prison, major nuclear arms deals. We're seeing stuff about mass murders, mass shootings. It's like death, violence, and property destruction tend to play well And so mass media outlets that are looking to drive clicks are going to do the same. They're going to run those stories, which again plays into the availability heuristics. So when you sit back, though, and you look at the actual crime statistics, what we can see is that over the course of the 90s, there's actually been less violent crime per 10,000 people or 100,000 people in the United States almost every year. And this is a very strong trend. In fact, we are safer, by and large, if we look at base rates, than we really have been at any point in the last 30 years. But if you read these headlines, if you think about things in terms of accessibility and availability, you wouldn't come to that conclusion. So this is the point where, if again I were to be teaching this in an actual classroom, I would do a fun little trick here. So I've adjusted it a little bit, and if you want to play along, go ahead and play along. But ordinarily in my class, I would split the room down the middle, and I would tell one half to think of 2 reasons they really like my class, and the other half has to think about 10 reasons that they really like my class. Then I go check Twitter and tell them to go to write down those reasons, and then I check back in about 5 minutes. That's the real trick about all of your professors, is that a lot of times these kinds of activities are so they can check their email. Don't tell anyone I told you. So ordinarily then, I would come back and I would say in this hypothetical experiment, to ask people to rate. And I would say, all right, hypothetically, how would you rate this person? So in the stream, let's say some of you wrote down 2 reasons why you like watching me. Some of you wrote down 10 reasons why you like watching me. And then I ask you to rate me. And I say, how would you rate this VTuber? Would you give me a 1? Would you give me a 10? Obviously all 10s, right? Or else you wouldn't be here. But what you find out is that when you tell people to write down 10 reasons that they like something versus 2 reasons, they tend to also rate that thing more highly, because those reasons then become more accessible. You sit down, you sit with it, you really think about these things, and then at the end of the day, you tend to like it more. And this is true across the board. So when you see people, whether you might have marketing materials that are asking you to stop and consider, what are the reasons that you like this thing? They're really trying to set you up to have a more positive impression overall by giving you generally positive response options. I mean, how many of us have seen a tech survey or a feedback survey where it's actually hard to give bad feedback, right? We see this all the time, and that's playing on accessibility and availability. When you sit somebody down and you basically say, all right, 1 is neutral, 2 is like, 3 is adore, and 4 is the best ever, how would you rate this? Well, you can't even give a bad option. And then by asking people to give that kind of response, it actually shifts their experience, because they're sitting down and saying, yeah, I gave them a 3, I guess. I guess I like them. And the more questions you have like that, the more stronger the effect is going to get. And it's all about ease of recall. By having someone sit and think about them, it makes it more accessible. Ease of recall plays into the availability heuristic, and people tend to end up liking the thing more. How about that? So fun one as well, and one that I think everyone has always done, everyone does all the time. I've done it multiple times today even. Hindsight bias. You knew it all along. After something has happened, you think that's how it would have happened if you had sat down to predict it. It's a fun one, right? And we do it all the time. You sit there and you're like, heaven forbid, let's say you're playing a fighting game or any kind of game, and you make a risky play, it doesn't work out, and you sit back and obviously that wasn't gonna work. Hindsight bias kicks in almost immediately. It's like you make the wrong choice, you pick the wrong thing, there you go. That's a very good observation. All right, question we had a point from the class here. So good example is that when we talk about the availability heuristic and how you can really only give positive feedback, and that's going to sort of skew people's attitudes more positively, YouTube recently did remove the dislike button, right? You can only say that you're either neutral or you like the video, which means that it's harder to see dislikes, it's harder to make that information accessible, and so on and so on and so on. Yeah, also very true. If you're playing Mahjong, good one about hindsight bias, there's no way that they're going, like, this is a brilliant move, and then you deal into someone's massive hand, and you're like, wow, that was the worst thing I could have done. It was so obviously wrong. Oh, so the dislike button is still there, but it doesn't tell you how many people disliked it. So you can't even see the base rate information. You can only see how many likes there are. Ah, that's... YouTube, what are you doing? It's such a goofy change. Make sure you press like on this video. Anyway, top-down processing. Let's hop back over to Chrome. We've gone on this one before, but I still think they're funny. So we talked about this a little bit before with the example of backmasking. So it turns out that by and large, let's see, where's my cursor? Where's my cursor? Where's my cursor? There it is. There it is. There it is. Here it is. When it comes down to how we process information, it turns out that the way that information is framed does a lot to influence the way that we interpret it. So in the past, like in one of the other videos, I played one of these for you, or a couple of these for you. Unfortunately, I'm going to get DMCA strikes if I play the forward versions, so I'm going to play them in reverse and then show you the lyrics. So you probably know this song, Hotel California by the Eagles. It's been a meme song for a while, so you've heard this. So the actual words, when said sort of as intended, is in the middle of the night just to hear them say. If we play it backwards, sounds like nonsense, right? It's just noise. But when you tell someone, Satan, he hears this, he had me believe in him, and then you listen to it again, I hear it. Because now I have this framing. I've been told that these are what the words are, and now all of a sudden I'm hearing them. The classic gotta catch 'em all, gotta catch 'em all, gotta catch 'em all from the Pokemon rap, when played backwards, sounds like this. But if you tell someone it's I love Satan over and over again, I can hear it. I can hear it, and I've given this example so many times. That's how powerful top-down processing is. If someone tells you what you're supposed to hear, it's a powerful framing effect. Here's a fun one. I cannot listen to Michael Jackson's Billie Jean anymore without hearing, but the chair is not my son. Like, go and listen to it when you get done with this video, and just think, the chair is not my son. You will hear it, and you will never unhear it. Let's do one more. I think it's fun. Let's see. Here's a really fun one. The Beatles, I'm so tired. It's just gibberish. Let's hear it again. Paul is dead man, miss him, miss him, miss him. How about that? I hear it again. These things work. They work on me. They work on the vast majority of people that I've gone through. And it's really kind of a weird quirk of how our brains work. When we are told this is the solution, it becomes very hard to see anything else or to hear anything else outside of that. So in this case, yeah. And what's fun is, because these are so effective, it's skewing how people hear stuff like this. This is how you come into the Paul McCartney conspiracies that he died and was replaced, and that the person walking around as Paul McCartney today is actually not Paul, and Paul actually died, and there's a whole world of conspiracy theories around this. There's a very interesting documentary that you could watch if you really wanted to. I think it's called Paul is Dead, actually, but it's good. It's at least fun if you think conspiracy theories are kind of fun to get into. Yeah. Oh god, it's a good one. Yeah, the misheard lyrics videos on YouTube comments. You hear it, you go back, you hear it in the song, and it's just there forever. All right, so let's jump back and get into lecture mode. All right, top-down processing. It's fun. It's powerful. It's a really cool thing to play with. So yeah, go ahead, check out the backmasking website, show your friends, and ruin all these other songs for them too. So another reason that this works is because we tend to have general ideas or about common properties about different objects, actions, and things. So the way that we tend to filter information is through the use of concepts, and we'll talk about schemas in a second. Basically, we have boxes we try to sort things into, and things like the representativeness and availability heuristics play into how we determine what box certain things go into. So you have an idea of what a dog is. I'm just going to pop her up here for a little bit. So you might say, this is a dog. This is my lovely assistant, Hazel. And you might say, all right, she's got a tail that wags. She's got kind of some gray on her nose. She got ears. She's got a long neck. This is a dog. These are the properties that I have of a dog. Unfortunately, those also might be properties of a bear. So again, we generally, like 99 times out of 100, 9,999 times out of 10,000, that concept of a dog is going to work. But then sometimes, just sometimes, you find these very weird quirks. And this is just how it works with our brains. We're right the overwhelming majority of the time, but then we turn around and think, maybe a bear is a dog. Maybe a hot dog is a sandwich. And so on and so on and so on. All right, Hazel, you can go back to sleep. She's actually sleeping on the couch behind me. It's adorable. And so we also, in addition to how we have concepts for things, we also have schemas, which are frameworks that we use for organizing knowledge. Think about it as an instruction manual for what you're supposed to do. So you might have an idea of how a grocery store works. You walk in, the carts are maybe somewhere near the entrance. You grab a cart, you walk through the aisles, you go to check out, you drop off your cart in the parking lot somewhere. And generally, that's going to work in the vast majority of grocery stores you go to. But every now and then, you might travel somewhere where maybe things are a little bit different. In grad school, my advisor had actually worked abroad for a while after her experience in grad school. So she got a job abroad. She worked as a faculty member, like somewhere in Europe. And one of the things that she always would bring up was how different grocery stores were and how hard it was to adjust, because she had this framework built up of what she's supposed to do and how she's supposed to conduct herself and how grocery stores work. And then she goes out to go buy groceries and it just doesn't apply in the same way. And we tend to be pretty rigid as well. And even if these schemas are generally simplifications, like we have ideas of how a Whole Foods works or Safeway, Kroger, whatever it is that you go to, we have a simplified abstraction, but when they break, they kind of fall apart. They're very rigid. And so our schemas are actually not always the best at accommodating new information. And that's how we end up in these moments of confusion or moments where we look kind of silly. All right, we've talked about some biases and heuristics. What about decision making? How do people make decisions? Well, generally, decision making is thought of by researchers as a process of choosing between alternatives. Whether it's products, whether it's courses of action, frequently we end up with A, B, C, D options in our lives. What do you want for breakfast? Are you going to sleep in? Are you going to go to the gym today? Which VTuber are you going to watch? Obviously, it's me. But by doing, in all these points, we have to make choices. And those choices oftentimes are made implicitly, because remember, we are cognitive misers. We don't want to use any more effort than we have to. And so, with these very small decisions, oftentimes we default to these cognitive biases and heuristics because they save us time and energy. I might open up the fridge and think, well, what am I going to have for breakfast? And I got some eggs there. There's some oatmeal. Maybe I've got some leftovers if I feel like just, being an absolute barbarian and eating leftover dinner, my dinner leftovers for breakfast. But maybe the closest thing to my hand when I'm going through the fridge is a pack of hash browns. And I'm just like, all right, that's it. It's not about anything else other than this was closer to me than the other things, and so I grab a hash brown and throw it in the toaster. It's not a complicated decision. A lot of these we don't even think about. You have to stop back, and if you ask somebody, well, how did you make that decision? They might not even be aware. They might not have a real narrative built up of, oh, well, I weighed these different options, and I did this, and no. They just did the thing that was the easiest in the moment. Yeah. And it's like, it's a good point. Also, like eating the same meals every day, or if you're like me, I basically have the same breakfast every day. I don't think about it. I just make the thing. And like, you know what? I put on a podcast, I fry some eggs, I make a bagel, and that's generally my breakfast every single day because it doesn't require any mental energy to think about it. I don't have to think about a different recipe. It just happens. I just get up, eggs, bagel, done. Ready. Yeah, and now there are times that, and this is again point from the class here, like, well then, what about times where you spend like so much time weighing different options and trying to make different decisions? Maybe you're trying to find a restaurant, maybe you're trying to pick out a doctor, or maybe you're trying to figure out an insurance plan at work. Depending on the decision, we tend to put more effort in proportion to how important that decision is to us. So yeah, breakfast doesn't matter. But if you have maybe a opportunity to impress a guest, you might put in a little bit more effort because the decision becomes more important. But that can sometimes backfire because remember, we do have these systematic biases in how we process information, meaning that sometimes putting in more energy is not necessarily going to give us a better result. So, for example, let's talk about framing and framing effects. So how you frame a question tends to really skew how people feel about it. And even if we put it in a lot of effort into thinking about these things, framing effects can be very powerful. So even when the underlying information is identical, people tend to frame them very differently. Let's just say you have a 5% chance of winning or a 95% chance of losing. Now, going back, remember how we talked about gotcha games and Skinner boxes and stuff, right? Here's another thing that gets leveraged, framing effects. You've got a 5% chance of rolling the thing that you want, the cool character or what have you. They don't tell you have a 95% chance of getting something you don't want. It's bad for business. And by framing it as 5% chance of getting the cool thing, far more people are going to spend money and roll trying to get it than if you had framed it as the alternative in terms of how much more likely you are to not get the thing. So when it comes down to problem solving, there's the next section here going on from decision making. Generally, the way we solve problems is by generating a strategy to accomplish a goal. We'll take a step back, think about what the goal we're trying to accomplish is, and then generate steps or a strategy to see how we can achieve that. And to do so, we oftentimes will use sort of cognitive algorithms or step-by-step procedures. Maybe like following a recipe or a formula or following a formula or anything like that. And so we have these, again, kind of like when we talked about schemas, inflexible or rigid perceptions of how we should be approaching problems. These are algorithmic in that we tend to come to the same conclusion and apply the same problem-solving strategies more or less every time we encounter the same problem. So let's just say, let's go back to breakfast again. So I'm hungry. I want to make food. And I go and I'm saying, I want egg on a bagel. That's my go-to breakfast. But I open up the fridge. There's no eggs. Can you imagine that? A fridge with no eggs. And so I might sit there and be puzzled because I have this step-by-step procedure. I get the eggs out, I grease the pan, I fry the eggs, I toast the bagel. Maybe there's some cheese involved. Maybe Hazel wants some cheese. She always wants cheese. Also, she always gets cheese. It's part of the daily routine now. But when I come to that position and there are no eggs, it derails the whole train. I might not even stop and say, all right, well, I'm just gonna, I'll have something else. I might just not have breakfast because it's so inflexible that once that one step of get the eggs and cook the eggs isn't possible, the whole thing falls apart for me. And it's like the same kind of thing. And even if, you could substitute something, like maybe I could just put something else on the bagel. Maybe I could make oatmeal instead or something like that. Or maybe you don't have enough butter to bake a cake. And you might end up, again, running out to the market and trying to do this because we have these inflexible problem-solving strategies versus something like just throwing in some olive oil instead of butter. It happens. But it's very funny to me when we stop and sit back, because knowing this doesn't change it, right? Like most of the stuff we've talked about in this course, knowing that our brains are weird in these specific ways doesn't change the fact that we come to these conclusions. Knowing that I am stuck in an inflexible pattern using these algorithms to make breakfast doesn't make it easier on me when I find out that I don't have eggs. It's just kind of a weird way of how our brains work. Yeah. Now, one way we can get over this, though, is by trying to break things into sub-problems or applying knowledge from prior situations. So if you do end up in a weird spot like this, again, let's look at the butter example. Maybe you were watching a cooking show and they had to do vegan baking, and you remember you can use olive oil. You've got knowledge from a prior situation. Or you might break things into sub-problems. Okay, I can't bake this cake because I don't have butter. I need to go to the market to get butter, and then I can come back and resume this. So when you stop and you sit back, and it's like there are ways to address this, but these tend to be more effortful than just following the step-by-step procedure that we usually do. Kind of like, again, think about a train. It's a well-oiled machine. It's on schedule. Something unexpected happens. It's rough. All right, catch up on the class discussion. Yeah, yep. Leftover pizza is powerful. All right. Obstacles to problem solving. So again, what are some things that can derail the train of our cognitive ability to solve problems? One thing is surface level similarities. Sometimes when we look at different problems, like a geometry problem versus a calculus problem that are both about trains, the surface level details can send signals to our brains to try to apply a cognitive framework that might not necessarily be the best solution to the problem. Also, once we tend to find one solution to a situation, it becomes harder to find alternatives. So again, you're stuck in the problem, you're baking, you don't have butter. If you go out and run to the market and that's the solution you've gone with before, it becomes harder to see alternatives like using substitutes that you might already have in your kitchen, because we tend to get very fixed in how we approach issues. We found a solution, that's the solution that works. Doesn't take any more energy than that. We're just going to use that and then keep using that. Another big kind of interesting point here, functional fixedness. Once we learn about an object's purpose, it is harder for us to use it in other ways. Kids tend to be better at these problems. But in general, when adults are confronted with problems like, here's a paperclip, how many different ways would you use this paperclip? Kids are tremendous at being able to come up with new, innovative ways to use it. But for adults, they're like, I guess I'd clip paper. That's it. So here's a fun one. When you give people these kinds of problems. So you have a target number you're trying to get. How would you use these different pictures to get these different answers? Again, there are usually multiple solutions. There are different ways to go about this. But generally, for adults and a lot of things, and even some kids, you find the one solution and it becomes harder to think about alternative ways of reaching that same solution. Kind of an interesting quirk, right? When you really think about it. And it's again, something that I think is very applicable. I see this in my own life pretty regularly, where it's like I've come to one solution to a problem, and it becomes very hard to think about other ways that it might work out. Or you might ask a group of people, here's a box of tacks, and here's a candle, given what's in this image, how would you mount this candle on a wall? This is hard. This is really hard. Now, people that do not necessarily have the same degree of functional fixedness for stuff like the tax or the box or the candle might come up with a solution like this. You can use the tax to secure the box to the wall and then put a candle on top of it. Or they might say, all right, well, can I use something outside of the, like, they're really thinking outside of the box very literally and saying, yeah, well, you know, this is some stuff here, but like, can I have a piece of wood? Can I have maybe like any kind, like a piece of wood? And here's where I put it on display that I have issues with this one. But there are some very inventive solutions that you can take to this problem. But it's very hard if you think about the box as just being the container for the tax. If you think literally outside the box and use it as part of the solution for the problem, it's actually not that difficult to figure out. But again, it's hard for a lot of people, and it's hard in very systematic ways because of the way that we tend to look at problems and solve them. Yeah. So we're talking the box and tax problems. If you put in, having more knowledge of the tools or the things that you've been given, aka the box is only for holding stuff, it's not part of the problem, you tend to struggle a bit. Whereas people that don't have a lot of knowledge about the tools tend to have less problem with solving it, even if it is a little bit difficult. It is a hard problem, a lot of people struggle with it, but people that do have less information about it, or children that are more imaginative in how they approach problems, tend to have a little bit of an easier time with this. All right, models of the mind. Trucking along here, we got a lot still to cover. So, is the brain like a computer? Kinda, sorta, it depends. Generally, our brains take cues from our bodies about the current state of things, and we try to infer our state based on that information. So some people, for example, might find that, let's see, smiling actually can increase their sense of happiness. And this is what we would call bottom-up processing, and I'm gonna have to grab this link because I'm a very good streamer and forgot to grab that one before. All right, let's bounce over to Chrome. Let's bring Chrome up. And let's make sure that this video is still around. Yes, it is. All right. Let's take a gander here. Because it turns out that one way to increase happiness is actually just to ask people to smile.
This is Edinburgh. According to a recent demographic study, it is home to the most miserable people in Britain.
This is a good city to come to on a pretty miserable day to test out an intriguing idea. Can I give the people of Edinburgh a little hit of pleasure? No drugs, nothing illicit, simply by using a pencil. So how are you feeling today on a score of 1 to 10?
5-0. Oh, a bit 5.
Would you like me to add a little pleasure to your day?
Go for it.
Great thing to walk up and ask a stranger.
Okay. Nice teeth. Okay. Is it doing anything for you?
Not really, no. Makes you feel a bit like a horse.
Very good smile.
Very good.
Yeah. Don't make us feel happier, right?
It is,
Yeah.
exactly. What happens is, when you put the pencil in your mouth like this, it makes you smile, and you're exercising the same muscles as when you smile. And what's strange is that a fake smile like this one can induce a hit of real pleasure. Is it beginning to kick in?
Yeah. I think it's quite funny though. Yeah.
Does it make you feel good?
Yeah, it does actually. I'm smiling.
You convinced?
I'm a bit worried about how many people's mouths.
I can promise these are sterilised, carefully cleaned pencils.
Oh, right,
What do you reckon?
yeah, I feel great.
Goofy video.
It goes from a 5 to a...
And everyone just goes along with it.
So what's going on? Well, it could simply be that your brain has learned to associate smiling with pleasure. But there's another rather intriguing theory. When I smile, I exercise the major zygomatic muscles. They tighten up, and that alters the blood flow to my brain. And it could be it is that which is triggering the feeling of pleasure. How are you feeling now then?
You have amused me. Well done.
Okay. You smile even when you're not feeling particularly happy.
I try to.
Okay.
I can.
And does that sort of elevate your mood?
I think so, yeah. I think it makes you feel a lot better.
So just by exercising these muscles, you can trick your brain into feeling pleasure. And to be honest, you don't even need one of these.
Kind of a fun little bit, right? Now, there is a caveat here, because there's always caveats, right? So when we're talking about top-down processing like this, and let's see, from the current slide, let's go. There we go, models of the mind. So there is experimental evidence on what we call embodied cognition. And that's to say that our brain takes cues from our bodies. So if we go out of our way to smile, or if we frown, we tend to, it shifts our way of thinking. So the smiling makes you happy is, it's a fun trick. It works for some people. Now, since I made these slides, let's just say that the field of embodied cognition has come under some fire. There have been some major failures in replication. In particular, some of the more extraordinary findings haven't necessarily panned out in the long run. But in some cases, like smiling, etc., like smiling, frowning, and all that, there is some evidence there that trying to sort of, our brain is taking cues from our body, and by shifting the position of our body, it can maybe have some impact on the way that we're feeling or the way that we're presenting ourselves. Now, again, a caveat here, though, is that, especially when you tell people, put this pencil in your mouth, it will make you happy. Yeah, like, we call that a demand characteristic, which you might remember from one of the early lectures. But yeah, there are some studies, but it's a little bit tenuous. It is a fun thing to show in class, though. All right. So that wraps up thinking and reasoning. Turns out our brains are weird. Turns out they take cues from the environment. Turns out they take cues from our body. It turns out that sometimes we're going to struggle to solve problems in some very systematic ways because we tend to try to use as little mental energy as possible when we encounter any new problem. And so we tend to rely on a system of tools and shortcuts and heuristics that don't always pan out in the long run. But it's generally gonna work. More often than not, these things work out for us, and they help us get through our days without having to stop and stress too much about every little thing that we come across. So generally, we think about these as being adaptive. I know what else is adaptive? Language. This is going to be a little bit of a hard pivot. It's a little bit of a weird pivot. Like I said, language doesn't fit super cleanly in any of the other sections that I have set aside. But let's get into it. All right. Language. How do we define language? Language is a combination of arbitrary symbols, and those symbols can be words, they can be gestures, they can be, again, verbal or nonverbal, but they generally fall into a system of rules that allows us to create and communicate meaning. So we don't just communicate information. We also communicate social and emotional information. If a person is walking around smiling, like in that video from the BBC, they're communicating a lot of information completely non-verbally. They're showing that maybe they're having a good day, maybe things are going well, maybe they just read one of my funny tweets. You never know. But you do see that information, they're communicating something, they're putting it out there. We call it body language even. It's a whole system of communication and information that we use, and sometimes we don't even think about. We're still able to get meaning out of. Language is a highly practiced, in fact, almost automatic process. Do you really stop and think about how you're reading? Do you stop and think about talking? At least when I'm speaking English or reading English, I don't even really think about it, which is miraculous when you really think about how convoluted and weird the English language is. But in general, languages tend to follow a system that must be coordinated in order to create meaning. We have phonemes, morphemes, syntax, and extra-linguistic information. Again, body language or other stuff that gets brought up. So what is a phoneme? A phoneme is the smallest real unit of distinct sound that we can make. It is a any sound that we can vocally produce, like fa, ba, ya, mat, bat, so on and so on and so on. What is a phoneme? A phoneme, the smallest unit of a phoneme is basically what we can mark as being perceptually distinct. A sound that is different enough and long enough to allow people to assign meaning to it and to use it in language. Language scientists have identified about 100-ish different phonemes, sort of the building blocks of language, but in general, most languages only use a handful of them. So unlike the English language, which is goofy and weird, if you get into other languages, like I've tried to learn Japanese and German, ba is ba, mo is mo, ka is ka. Or in German, like a, b, c, d, and it's like if you go through the ABCs, those sounds don't change. Whereas in English, you use dramatically more phonemes because, well, English is very interesting in that the sound of a word or a letter tends to change based on what precedes it and what follows it. If you want to stop and think about it for just a second, every S in Mississippi is pronounced differently. It's Frankenstein's monster of language. And so a lot of phonemes are leveraged in order in the English language to make things work. As a consequence, people can, again, like repeat a word almost exactly as they've been told and then find out that it's wrong. Or the difference between R's and L's. Some languages don't make a perceptive difference between that, but in English we do. Now, whereas a phoneme is a perceptually distinct unit of sound, a morpheme is the smallest unit by which we can assign meaning. That's a fun point. The reason that the Japanese people have a hard time learning the V sound is because it's not naturally part of the language and only taught later in life. Huh, I didn't know that. I guess that makes sense why it's usually separated in the alphabet as well. Or at least on the charts that I've looked at. All right, so morphemes, smallest units of language that we can assign meaning to. Dog, bad, cat, bat, so on and so forth. These are often words, not always words, because they can also be modifiers like non or re. So things like non-binary, which is of course the first thing that came to my mind, are going to fall into that morpheme category. Binary, again, is a unit of meaning. I think it is a morpheme that can be modified. So those two units combined are used as building blocks to create language following syntax, the rules for constructing sentences and how to make different words. So how you apply modifiers to a word follows a set of rules. So basically things like word order, morphological, I'm going to struggle with this word, morphological markers like S's for plurals, ed for past tense, and sentence structure are going to fall under syntax. Now, in practice, you don't have to be precise for things to maintain meaning. If you're like me, sometimes you say words and people just kind of pick up on it, even if they didn't necessarily follow flawless syntax, especially if I'm trying to do multiple things at once, or I'll use the wrong words, and, it's a kind of a mess. Language is hard. But people can generally figure it out, at least the people that I tend to be around often enough are just like, yeah, it's just how she is. So, there are, however, weird exceptions. And again, syntax in language is complicated because, for example, now in English, typically you would add S to the end of a word to denote that there's more than one. But deer is both singular and plural. There are times, and it's like, let's say, speak and spoke, you wouldn't say speaked to denote that somebody has said something in the past. You would say spoke. It's kind of one of those, it's just an interesting quirk in how syntax works because, again, going back to the English language, we kind of learn these things implicitly. We don't really think about them. And it's kind of like a really, really weird thing to think about, right? Like trying to apply this lens sort of a scholarly psychological lens to language production and comprehension kind of breaks my brain a little, because I think about this so rarely despite the fact that I use it all the time. It's like when I first tried to learn a second language and I realized how unusual English was and how hard it is to actually learn and speak. Yeah, it is actually, in a weird way, having English as a first language is actually kind of kind of lucky, because I can't imagine trying to learn this nonsense later in life. So on top of our syntax and our morphemes and our phonemes, extra linguistic information plays a huge role in how we figure out what is actually being communicated aside from the actual the actual text of the message. Stuff like facial expressions, tone of voice, the setting, and are used to interpret things. And sometimes this can cause problems, especially in email and texting, because you don't really get that kind of extra linguistic information. So bless the person who came up with \sarcasm trying to address this problem and trying to bring in some of that extra linguistic information into online communication. I mean, let's take an example here. You go up and you ask somebody, "Hey, how you doing?" And they say, "Great." You think there, and it's like, all right, the text, like, if you had no extra linguistic information, if they roll their eyes at you, they maybe sigh, they do all kinds of stuff, from that information, they're being sarcastic and they're actually not doing great. But if you take it at face value, without that, it's kind of hard to extrapolate the correct meaning. So yeah, extra linguistic information, body language, tone of voice, etc., are hugely important in how we communicate things to each other. Now, there are dialects that tend to emerge. These tend to be more regionally based, but they're generally variations that still would be grouped within the same language. Again, they tend to be denoted into specific geographic areas or different groups. But generally, they are still consistent with syntax. So I am one of those people. I lived in the South for long enough that I picked up y'all. I grew up in the Midwest, moved to the South, and at first I was like, haha, I'm going to say y'all ironically, and then it wasn't ironic anymore. So now, without thinking about it, I will say y'all and not you all, but it's still the English language. I'm still using the same syntax, I'm following the same rules, so at the end of the day, dialects tend to be fairly consistent. So it might be more difficult, there might be turns of phrase that don't necessarily make sense between one dialect or region or another, but they follow the same rules, and generally meaning can still be communicated using those same tools. So why do we use language? I mean, you think about it, if you want to take the ev-psych or the evolutionary psych perspective, language is a curious tool because it takes a very long time to learn, takes up dedicated space in our brain, and most other animals don't have these same highly complicated iterative ideas about communication. Dogs can communicate, cats can communicate, most animals have some version of communication, but especially in the case of humans, it is a tremendously complicated matter. But there are advantages to doing so. Thanks to syntax and morphemes and the highly complicated rules of language that we develop and teach each other, we're able to coordinate our social interactions and are able to communicate complex ideas to one another. Now, learning language is very interesting to me. So we're going to get a little bit into the developmental side of things here. Children tend to recognize their native language before they are born. Even with infants, they will show differential responses based on the language that is being spoken to them well before they're able to really comprehend any kind of meaning. Now, a lot of this comes from the fact that they hear that language in the womb. So when they're able to, let's say a person's mother is speaking to them in English, they are kind of starting to pick up the language. They're learning to recognize the phonemes and the sounds that are present in that language. And so later then, let's say that infant is born and they are going to maybe respond, maybe squirm, have some kind of orientation toward that language that they've heard in the womb relative to a language that they have not heard before. During the first year of life, babies tend to start to babble. And this is sort of the beginning phase of language. They might start to recognize phonemes as well and be able to, again, recognize individual sound bites based on the languages they're familiar with. But babbling is part of a baby being able to figure out control of their vocal tracts to reproduce phonemes and then gradually work onto morphemes. Remember, phonemes are just sounds, morphemes have meaning. And so at the babbling stage, the baby might not necessarily have any meaning behind what they're doing, but it's giving them experience with controlling their own vocal tracts and reproducing the phonemes that they're hearing around them. Now, when it comes to learning words and trying to understand meaning, if you've tried to learn a language later in life, you know this first one pretty handedly. Comprehension tends to precede production. In fact, they're different versions. They're actually completely different areas of the brain, even. We have an entirely different neural circuitry dedicated to being able to recognize words and comprehend language compared to the same mechanisms that we use, or the mechanisms that we use to produce language. So I've been doing Duolingo. Every now and then I stream it, and I really find it tremendously difficult when it asks me to produce language. It gives me a sentence in English and says, write this out in German, relative to when someone is just speaking German to me. Like, it's kind of funny, honestly. And like, I've had some weird moments in my life. So again, I grew up, I have a lot of family in Germany. I'm really not that good of a German speaker, but we would get phone calls and I would have, my, Großtantas and stuff. So my great aunts, my great uncles, who would call looking to talk to my mom, and I would know what they were saying. On the phone, I knew what they were asking me, and I wouldn't have to think about it, because my parents spoke German when I was very young around the house, and so I do have very strong comprehension skills. However, when it comes to production, I am totally helpless. So when my great aunt is calling, who only speaks German, I can understand what she's saying, but for the life of me, I could not tell her that my mother was not home. It's completely different sections of the brain, and it's very frustrating to be in that situation. Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, if you live in, like, let's say you're Canadian and you live in a bilingual province, like, you might be around French people, you can understand it. Because comprehension, again, is we tend to pick it up. Our brains are kind of attuned to doing it. But production is much more effortful and very hard to get into. So yeah, you might be around people that speak French. You might understand French by and large. You might just kind of pick it up over time. Trying to speak it, though, that's a totally different kettle of fish. Now, going back to the developmental side of things, generally, people are able to recognize their own name by about 6 months, and then by about a year are able to comprehend other words. And then around 1 year, a child tends to start to be able to produce words on their own. So, the classic example is the mama, dada, maybe the name of the dog, something along those lines. But then over time, there's an exponential increase in the vocabulary that people tend to have. It's sort of, once the framework exists there, once the engine of language acquisition has really revved up, the person has figured out how to control their vocal cords, their vocal folds. They're able to produce sound. They understand, phonemes and morphemes. All of a sudden, it's just like, it just clicks. We are, especially early in life, we are vacuums for information about language. And once we figure this stuff out, we just suck up all this information. And also, which is why people that grow up in bilingual homes or maybe go to a second language school or something like that tend to find it much easier to learn languages earlier in life than those of us who try to learn other languages as an adult. It's just, there's a period of development where we're basically sponges for this kind of information. But as we also are growing, we tend to also play with meaning a bit and tend to figure out specificity. So, well, like, the good examples here are calling non-relatives dad, because dad might just be any older masculine relative, or calling the family pet dog because it's maybe the only dog that you've ever experienced. And so you tend to overextend word meanings, but also in part because the child might not know the word uncle or something like that yet. So generally we go on, then we start to go from using words, we start to use single words to convey meaning, and start to comprehend basic syntax. So around 2 years old, again, just vacuums, sponges for vocabulary and meaning and language, but syntax comes later. So it kind of really mirrors even the way that I talked about this before. We basically get control of our vocal folds, start to just produce sound, eventually kind of figure out meaning and or meaningful combinations of phonemes, eventually gravitates into single words as we build up bigger vocabularies, and then gradually start to work on syntax. Now, there is some debate. If you look at older textbooks, you're going to come to this idea about a critical period for language development. And that is usually used as a way to refer to whether or not a person is able to learn language overall based on whether or not they have mastered a language before a critical period. Usually that's somewhere around puberty. Now, the time frame is not that strict, and it's more like there's a sensitive period. In general, you can develop language skills later on. If a person is deprived of social contact and doesn't develop language skills earlier in life, they can still figure out syntax and these kinds of things. It just might take a little bit of time. So in the case of Jeannie, who we've talked about before, she was neglected until she was 13 years old, chained in a back room with little to no communication. Now, she may have never fluently learned language, but that might also be due to the extreme abuse that she suffered and not just a critical period. This goes back all the way to the research methods point that we've talked about. So early on, and if you haven't seen it, go check my YouTube. There's a link down there to early on. So when we talked about Jeannie as an example of a case study. Sometimes just wild stuff happens. And there's no way to really measure it empirically via experiments. So what people do is they try to intensively study this one situation and then try to extrapolate it. Jeannie's case was really used to argue about this critical period for language, but it's not conclusive, and so there's a lot of wishy-washy stuff here. So if you're taking this class from, I don't know, heaven forbid, a meat tuber professor, they might use that language when talking about language. It's not as clear-cut there. It's not like, well, you turned 13 and you haven't mastered English, now you're never going to master a language at all. Nothing is ever that clear-cut in this work. Now, home signers, or deaf children that are born to hearing parents but don't necessarily learn American Sign Language, do also tend to invent their own forms of communication. Again, our brains are very attuned to this kind of stuff, and even in the absence of sort of formal education in a language, people will figure out their own phonemes, morphemes, and versions of syntax. Now, it does take some education for home signers to achieve full language, but again, it's not so much that there's a critical period where, oh no, well, you didn't fully learn sign language by puberty, you're never going to learn it. Nothing's ever that clear cut. I mean, if there's one thing you take away from any of these videos, whenever you encounter any kind of pop psych or anything like that that says, here's the answer, and it is clear cut and it fits in a 280 character tweet, do not trust that information. Nothing is ever that concise in psychology. But like I said, in general, people find it much easier to learn new languages when they are young. It just works out. We have this sort of, again, sponge brain for language. And it becomes much easier because our brains are already churning and figuring out syntax and communication and all that. Yeah, it's just easier. And if you're like me, it's very hard to learn a language later on in life. All right, so sign language. Let's pivot a bit here. Sign language is actually not just gestures. Sign language is a form of visual communication that has all of the features of spoken language. Phonemes, morphemes, syntax, and in fact, when people use sign language, if you put them in an MRI, the same areas of the brain that are in charge of vocal language production are going to light up in that MRI because our brains are highly adaptive. Like, remember, like I said, how there is a whole section of the brain that is attuned to language acquisition and another one that is attuned to language development? Well, remember that whole cool thing about neuroplasticity? Even people who are deaf and will still use those same parts of the brain, but rather than communicating vocal language, they follow the same developmental track and use the same brain areas, the same neural circuits, in order to develop sign language skills and other skills for communication. It's just a very critical part of our development as people, and so we tend to do it. It just comes naturally to us, especially younger, as we're younger, in terms of being able to develop our communication skills, because if you want to use the evolutionary psych perspective, communication is an asset for survival. And so we have evolved, according to the EvPsych perspective, to have this period in development where we are very much attuned to developing communication and figuring out how to communicate ideas to other people. Now, in the case of multilingualism, I'm going to focus on bilingualism. Usually, one of the languages is dominant, but people that are fully bilingual tend to be proficient in both languages. Now, they also follow the same stages of development. And so let's take, for example, if you grow up in a bilingual home. Maybe you're at home and you have a combination of Spanish and English spoken at home. Now, the person might be slower to learn syntax, and they might make some systematic errors where they might cross wires in the grammatical rules or the syntax of those different languages that they're learning. But by and large, people that are growing up in bilingual or multilingual environments are going to follow the same developmental stages, even if one of those languages does end up being dominant over time. And what this does lead to, though, is what we call meta-linguistic thought, which is sort of, again, think about the meta prefix. It's sort of thinking about languages. People that grow up in bilingual or multilingual homes tend to be incredibly good at figuring out the structure of language and breaking down how languages differ, how the pieces fit together, and sorting all that information out. So if you grew up in a multilingual home, or maybe you grew up bilingual, let's say you speak French and English at home. You grew up because your brain was attuned to be able to process that information, and you have sort of the developed syntax set up, you have really good skills with metalinguistic thought. You at the age of 24 might decide, you know what, I want to learn Spanish. And it might come very easily to these people compared to someone like me, again, who grew up in a monolinguistic home, because my brain just isn't attuned to that. It's harder for me to think in metalinguistic ways because I usually don't think about language like that. I just sort of say words, and usually it's the words that I mean. So how do we acquire language? There are some different theories about this. One is that we just imitate our parents. Doesn't match up because language is generative. Remember how we talked about deaf kids that are raised by hearing parents? Those children still develop their own understanding and system of communication because language is generative. And even in the absence of that same, like those avenues of feedback, again, deaf child hearing parents or deaf parents hearing child, they're still able to develop language skills. So there is some idea that we call the nativist account, which is that we are innately born with some language. But there's also social pragmatic accounts, which is sort of taking the learning trajectory, where we talked about what sort of operant and classical conditioning, that we tend to use social or environment structures and operative learning to develop language based on the feedback that we get. So being able to infer topics, actions, expressions, etc., are things that we gradually learn from being sort of conditioned by our environments. Now, the general cognitive process account here, these are all different theories, so we're just going to talk about them here. The general cognitive process account basically says that language is not all that special, but it fails to account for the fact that children are better at learning and that we have specific brain areas that are used for language processing. So a cognitivist would say, yeah, that you just learn like you learn anything else. Language is like riding a bike. You practice, you get feedback, you correct it, and so on and so forth. But again, it fails to account for the fact that language is a very special skill, and one that our brains are particularly attuned to develop as children, when we even seem driven to develop communication skills in the absence of other people to communicate with. Moreover, we would say that in terms of cognitivism, or people that tend to be very focused on cognition, most cognitivists would say that non-human animals probably don't have the same level of cognitive complexity that we do. However, they still develop forms of complication. They might differ in complexity and type. It might be scent, it might be visual, it might be vocal, it might even be Thanks for the bits. I forgot the alert box was on. Anyway, I got sidetracked there for a second. I'm thinking about cuttlefish in particular. So think about even marine life. Think about octopi and cuttlefish. So if you don't know, cuttlefish and octopi can actually, in most species, change the texture of their skin, but also their color. And by doing that, they can even signal different things to each other. It's a form of communication. And it's like even under the sea, where we would say that things like visual communication are not possible, they still happen. Or it's like, actually no, because whale song exists. Anyway, you get the idea, right? Massively different medium, massively different forms of communication, they still happen. In general, communication tends to be used for mating or aggression, but in some cases can actually be more complex. Let's bounce back over to here. Oh, let's see. There it is. Probably familiar with the flight of the bumblebees, right? Bees can communicate incredibly complex information. It's marvelous. Like the moment you stop and think about language like this, and then you stop and think about bees, it's incredible, right? They can put out so much information in just these little dances.
Honeybees have some fascinating abilities, among them being able to communicate by performing a unique dance. It informs hive mates where a newly discovered food source is located. Every cycle of this waggle dance roughly describes the shape of the figure 8. Let's rewind and look in more detail. The bee only waggles on a part of its route, the straight run, indicated here by the waved line. The secret lies in the direction of the straight run, or to be more precise, in the angle between the straight run and the perpendicular, which in this case is 90 degrees to the left. This tells the other bees that food is available 90 degrees to the left of the sun. If the angle is 60 degrees to the right, they'll be flying 60 degrees to the right of the sun.
Blows my mind how much information bees can communicate. I mean, think about this. Oh, the Montgomery Bay Aquarium sea otter camera. It looks like a too destructive. I know, it's wild,
Honeybees
right?
have some fascinating abilities,
watch
among
again.
them being able to communicate by performing a unique dance. It informs hive mates where a newly discovered food source is located. Every cycle of this waggle dance roughly describes the shape of the figure 8. Let's rewind and look in more detail. The bee only waggles on a part of its route, the straight run, indicated here by the waved line. The secret lies in the direction of the straight run, or to be more precise, in the angle between the straight run and the perpendicular, which in this case is 90 degrees to the left. This tells the other bees that food is available 90 degrees to the left of the sun. If the angle is 60 degrees
What
to
are
the
your
right,
secrets, bees?
they'll be flying 60
Yeah,
degrees
social
to the
insect
right
communication
of the sun.
is wild. because it's so alien to us, right? It's like we have our own forms of communication, we think about things in particular ways, but then you come down to it and you look at how many ways and forms of communication exist in the world, and it's just wild. It's really wild. It's cool. I love this stuff. I really love this stuff. Yeah. And it's like, so that, yeah, this is a good point. Raina just brought this up in chat, that like some species of ants have actually invented farming. Like, it requires incredibly complex communication, and yet they do it. They're able to do irrigation and farm, and basically, bugs are terrifying. They're absolutely too smart. Anyway, let's move on before I start getting into, I start thinking about our new ant overlords. All right. So there is an interesting caveat here, and we call it linguistic determinism. We speak, therefore we think. Can cognition exist without language? Now, the answer to that is pretty simple. Yeah, children are able to perform cognitive tasks before speaking. If you ask a child who's pre-verbal to sort things like square peg, square hole, circle into circle hole, and all that, they can generally figure out the task. They can put like with like. They can sort things as they need to, even before they're able to speak. And our language areas of the brain are not always active during thought. We have emotional and non-verbal cognition in addition to our linguistic cognition, our thoughts, our feelings. Remember when we talked about memory, we talked about episodic memory, where you can tell a story about what happened to you. That's a linguistic memory, but not all of our memories are linguistic. But it is less radical to say that maybe we have a little bit of linguistic relativity. Again, one way is to say that it's hard and fast. There is no thought without language. Nah, forget it. But there is linguistic relativity in how we think about things. The way we think about things, the way we frame verbal thoughts can shape the way that we interpret the world. So we're going to go back, we're going to revisit Elizabeth Loftus, and in this case, Loftus and Palmer in 1974. When I would teach this class, I would tell half of the room to close their eyes and half of the room to watch. But I can't necessarily do that on Twitch, so let's just pretend. So I would usually then show this footage, and I'm going to show this off here, and I would ask one half of the room one question and one half of the room another. Usually I would show the slide, I would show the footage, and then, different questions, different answers. So let's take a look back over on Chrome, and let's check out this footage. So this is the 1974 footage used in Loftus and Palmer's landmark study in linguistic relativity. Love psychology. We just get to do stuff like this. Did you know they had fun crashing cars? Like, how could you not have fun doing this? Like being a psychologist is great. I can't lie. You get to just crash cars sometimes. I have a fun story for office hours. All right. So getting back to it. So now in this study, they asked people two questions. They either asked people, how fast do you think the cars were going when they smashed into each other? Or how fast do you think the cars were going when they hit each other? The only difference in the question is smashed versus hit. And you can probably guess what happens. Generally, when you tell people that they smashed into each other, you get a bigger answer. They tend to overestimate the speed that the cars were going. Hit tends to produce a lower estimate. It's sort of, it's a framing effect. Again, bringing back in and tying this back into reasoning, the way that we use language is important for how we frame problems and how we frame information. And that framing has an important impact and a powerful impact on how we interpret things. So even if you ask the same person that question at different times, you showed them that footage and you said, these cars smashed into each other. How fast do you think they were going? You wait a couple weeks, you come back to it. These cars hit each other. How fast do you think they were going? Even the same person would probably give two radically different responses because linguistic information and framing effects have a powerful impact on how we interpret the world around us. And as you know from last time, Elizabeth Loftus is now studies eyewitness testimony. So reading is an extension of language. Generally, reading is a pretty automatic process. If I were to tell you that you're reading these slides manually, you still can't turn it off, but you are now reading my slides manually. It's a highly automatic process, but it's one that, because it is so automatic, like our biases, like our cognitive heuristics, is one that is prone to causing problems. So here's another fun classroom demonstration that you might encounter if you take this class in the meet space. You have people read this, and you have people read the words. You have one half of the room read the word, and they say, rabbit, house, blanket, dance, flower, key, 7, dance, house, key, 7, flower, rabbit, blanket. Then you ask them to read the color of the word, like to read out the color while going through the second list. So I'm saying, oh God, I already fucked up. I almost said red. See, it's hard. It's hard because you tell people only attend to the color of the text. So you should say yellow, green, brown, black, red, yellow, red, purple, black, blue, green, purple, blue, brown. If you're reading through that second list and you're telling people to read the color of the font and not the word, it should be easy, right? But it is hard because we read things automatically. Even if I'm trying to tune it out and only focus on the color of the text, it's hard. It's really, really hard. We call it the Stroop effect. It's so commonplace and so easy to replicate that it has a name. Yeah, so we call it the Stroop interference task. Basically, it's very easy to read that, but if you start reading the word red, but it's in yellow font, and this works the same way too. And the brown, green, the black, yellow. Yeah. Yeah, this is a thing, isn't it? It shows up in the brain training thing. Is it a brain training thing? I want to say it is in the brain games that were on the Nintendo DS. Yeah, it's a fun one to pull on people because you would think it's so easy, but again, it's very powerful. Again, like just knowing that, all right, well, my brain is going to try to read things. I have to turn off that part of my brain. Doesn't turn it off. It is very hard to not attend to this kind of information because it's there. It's prolific. It's in our faces, and it's so hard. It is so hard to not attend to this kind of info. Now, when it comes to reading, though, generally there are some prerequisites that we have to go through before we can develop reading as a skill. One, we have to think about writing as meaningful. We have to learn different ways how writing moves in specific directions. We need to learn to recognize patterns in the alphabet. And we need to learn that printed letters correspond to specific sounds. If you've ever tried to learn Japanese or any language that has a non-phonetic alphabet, this is hard. And it's hard mostly because of the third point there. It's trying to recognize that these symbols correspond to sounds that correspond to meaning, and so on and so on. Now, generally, over time, though, once we learn that the words are flowing in a certain direction, that certain symbols are connected to sounds, over time, we master two different skills and become experts. We recognize that we are able to recognize a word without sounding them out. So if you have a certain level of experience with a language, odds are you can actually look at that language, see a word that you don't know, and just pronounce it without having to think about it because we can do the work of interpreting, again, the phonemes, those building blocks of language. We can just do them in our heads. And we also learn how to sound out unfamiliar words. So we tend to just kind of look them out. And if it is so unfamiliar and so alien, we're able to sound it out. We call this phonetic decomposition. All right. So fun thing about, let's talk about speed reading here for a second. And this is really I think this is the last slide I have on language. So speed reading. On average, most people tend to read between 200 to 300 words per minute. If you start getting above 400 words per minute, comprehension drops off pretty hard. So a lot of those speed reading courses tend to try to pitch that they can get you to read 500 or 600 words per minute. It's not that easy because you have to comprehend that information. And so in speed reading, you tend to learn to read faster, but to understand less and to comprehend less because there's less mental energy to go around with the words that you're reading. So in general, we kind of have a soft cap on how fast we can really read. And once you get above 400 words per minute, you start to drop off in how much information you're actually retaining. This is a fun trick I learned in grad school. Turns out that we all have to speed read. So when you're in grad school, and I was getting my doctorate, or like you're in grad school, if you're someone like me and you're off trying to get a doctorate, sometimes you have thousands of pages of reading to do in a given week. And the way I got by was by learning to read the first and the last sentence of everything I had to go through. And now, oddly enough, most academics have adapted to write. Like academic writing is structured in such a way where even the way that you work out your paragraphs, in the way of doing a favor to other academics, you tend to write where you can get by just reading the first and the last sentences. But it's kind of the same deal. And it's like, I found that that was the only way I could really make sense of the information, because if I tried to read the whole thing, just skimming it very quickly, I wasn't retaining any info. So one way to actually up my speed reading, quote unquote speed reading, was just to cut down on the amount of information I was actually taking in. Yeah, it's great. It's wonderful. Let us just say that I have yet to be able to reach a point where I can read for fun. Because again, cramming thousands of pages of reading in every week for many, many years basically has ruined my ability to read things. And so now, even without thinking about it, I default to the speed reading technique of just like reading every other word or reading only certain sentences. Like I'll read the first, the middle, and the last sentence in a paragraph and then just try to figure out the rest. Yeah, it turns out that it's a hard habit to break. But anyway, that's what I got. So that concludes this section talking about the wonderful and sometimes frustrating and sometimes mysterious world of cognition and language. It turns out that our brains, again, are just systematically wrong about things all the time. And part of that does pertain to language as well, in that they are kind of interconnected, especially when you get into stuff like framing effects and how we construe and explain our thought process on certain things. Yeah, we tend to follow certain sets of rules. It's kind of a cool topic that I really do enjoy going through. So the next chapter is going to be a fun one. So if you had fun with this, click the follow button, do all that stuff, whatever. Like, check out my YouTube if you want to see some of the older content. I've been doing this for a couple of weeks. So this is I guess in some of my background, by training, I'm a research psychologist, and I wanted to do something kind of pulling from that in terms of streaming content. So apart from just playing games and chatting and doing whatever, I decided to produce an entire course. So I am teaching an entire Psych 101 course via Twitch and putting up archives on YouTube and all of that. And on that note, Chapter 9 is next, and Chapter 9 covers intelligence. So it's the IQ test chapter. It's going to be very fun. I have some very, very strong opinions about this whole fucking area. Oh, it makes me so angry. Anyway, so if you wanna come by, it's a little bit of a shorter one. I'll probably do this in the next week or two, but it's gonna be fun. So yeah, thanks for hanging out. I'm gonna transition over to office hours and chill for a bit, but I appreciate y'all being here. Yeah. Oh god, fuck Mensa. Oh my god, why would you mention them? Why would you mention them? Fuck. Why would you bring them up? All right, I'm going over to office hours before I lose my mind. One of the few things I feel the strongest about. So let's I'm gonna transfer over to my chatting screen where I actually have the angry deer noises set up. Let's class is over. See you next time.